The origins of Final Fantasy XIV, as it released in the second half of 2010, was indicative of Square Enix's attitude at the time. Of course this new MMO will be a success, they must have told themselves. We're both making it just like Final Fantasy XI, which was a success, and riding the name of Final Fantasy. This can only be a triumph. Arrogance like that led to a dismally received MMO, one that felt archaic compared to its direct competition, was completely unoptimized due to misusing their proprietary game engine Crystal tools, and a lack of structured content which led to a feeling of confusion and meandering. The level design was terrible too, the maps of the zones being copy-pasted segments repeated ad nauseum. It was so bad, the new leads decided the best way to fix the game was to end it, remake it, and start fresh 3 years later. Making this part of the story too, with the land suffering a cataclysmic event the moment the original servers shut down. Enter A Realm Reborn. Now I can't possibly do the whole story of the original release of this game its proper justice. However, the documentary series by NoClip and the Fall and Rise series by Speakers Network are both excellent videos to watch for that. Speakers Network also has a sub-series that explores the areas of the original release in detail using a tool to wander the game assets. I'll link all these in the description of the video. But regardless, unlike the original release of the game, A Realm Reborn received much higher praise. And a lot of this is due to the change in director, who set clear goals and had a much clearer end goal in sight. Naoki Yoshida, otherwise known as Yoshi P, worked on Dragon Quest X before being assigned as 14's director, and for the new direction of A Realm Reborn would take, sought out inspiration from modern MMOs he knew to be successful, namely World of Warcraft and the games that it inspired. He also knew that the way the content was produced for the original 14 was too slow due to the way content was pipelined, and so sought to smooth out the development cycle. Where previously a potted plant could contain more polygons than a character model and each cutscene was custom animated, the focus was put on getting stuff made first, then making it prettier or more custom where it mattered. Cutscenes make use of canned animations now, which both streamline their development and with the animations themselves being perfectly adequate, don't require too much extra work. This much clearer and objective-driven development had to have been part of what turned the game around from a failure to what is now one of the most played MMOs in the world. Just a quick note about the footage going forward, I changed my character's hairstyle with the expansion, so the short style with the ponytail is for A Realm Reborn, and the long hairstyle is for Heavensward. Just thought that was a nice way to notice where the footage is from a glance. It's a wonder people like to spend time in the world of Final Fantasy XIV. The graphics, specifically the world, still provide some stunning sights. This is an aspect of the game that seemingly just gets better as the expansions go on. The city-states all look great and full of character, from the ports and walkways of Limsa Lominsa, to the gothic cathedral aesthetic of Ishgard, from the varied deserts and oases of Fanalan, to the thick forests of the Shroud. The results of the calamity that ended the original release of the game scarred the land in several places, with great shards towering over the surroundings. Even in these older Realm Reborn zones, I still found myself in awe of some of the sights you can see on your journey. As this is an MMO, the graphics of course can't be completely perfect. Even on max settings, a lot of textures can look really ugly. Specifically, it can be some ground textures or miscellaneous objects look like they've been made from like 3 polygons, and some character armor looks like it has really low resolution textures applied to them. This is due to the nature of MMOs of course. The game needs to be able to run with tons of player and non-player characters rendered at once, and lower resolution assets on things that can either be easily overlooked or ignored makes sense in the long run, and also solves the optimization issue the original game had by proper distribution of rendering resources. It does suck that some main characters suffer from this low resolution disease though, especially poor Hien from the Stormblood expansion. I can literally count the pixels on his jacket. The canned animations for cutscenes, while not immersion breaking or anything like that, do end up taking away from characters' individuality a bit at times. The animations are linked to their races, so every Lalafell character will make the same angry expression in conversation, every Elizon will have the same explaining emote, etc, etc. It's one of those things I feel that you have to willingly overlook to see the intent behind the expression, even if it could be distracting if you notice it too much. Sorry about that. Combat in Final Fantasy XIV is very different from the last MMO in the series, mostly in how it's now a modern tab targeting system like in World of Warcraft. The game is designed around being able to be played on controller too though, which makes it wholly unique amongst its peers. It supports controllers out the gate and feels effortless to play with one. A lot of people doing the hardest content in the game use a controller too, so it's extremely viable. So how the combat works is that using a weapon skill starts the global cooldown, or GCD for short. By default in this game it's 2.5 seconds, which is significantly slower than WoW. So when I use my monk ability Bootshine on an opponent, I wait 2.5ish seconds, then I can press the next button I want to. Final Fantasy XIV focuses a lot on combos for the melee classes as well, which is something that WoW doesn't do. So to stick with my monk, I start with Bootshine, which opens up the combo to either keep my damage buff with Dragon Fang, or do more raw damage with True Strike. This follows up with the last part of my combo, which I either finish with Demolish, which applies a damage over time effect, or Snap Punch, which is a heavy hit. Balancing your personal buff and damage over time on the enemy is how most combat in 14 is resolved, with the use of other abilities in between GCDs to inflict even more damage. By the end game, the initially slow feeling 2.5 second GCD doesn't feel so slow anymore, and you end up pressing a lot more buttons in order to optimize your damage output, creating a much higher amount of inputs per minute. Learning how to use all these abilities you can kind of figure out for yourself if you take time to read the tooltips for each skill, although there's plenty of resources on the internet if you want to learn it that way too. The Balance Discord is a great place to start to see guides for whichever job you're playing. The job system is definitely one of my most liked aspects of the game, especially with how it compares to other MMOs. Each job is assigned a role, one of 5. These are Tank, Healer, Melee DPS, Ranged Physical DPS, or Magical DPS. Each of these roles are given specific role actions on top of their job skills. Examples of these include basic mitigation tools for tanks, ways to reduce magical or physical damage as a magical melee DPS, and a way to refresh MP for the magical roles. These become especially useful in the harder content where they're used to allow the group to clear more efficiently. What's great about the jobs outside of their role in combat, however, is the fact that you can have all the jobs unlocked on your one character. There's no need for all characters. In fact, it's far more efficient to have everything available to you on one character. It allows you more flexibility, especially if you want to mix things up, and also you get an experience bonus when leveling a job that's lower than your highest one. It's nothing to sneeze at too, it's an extra 50%. This makes leveling other classes much less daunting than in something like WoW, where the class is tied to the character. So to level another one, you'd have to go through the story again to level. Each job in 14 plays in rather unique ways, even if they've been simplified over the years. It can be argued that the way Dark Knight plays now feels like Discount Warrior, but everything around their base damage rotations is so different, I don't think that rings completely true in my opinion. This is a thing for the healers too. In the recent rework, healer DPS was incredibly simplified, giving each healer exactly 1 damage attack and 1 damage over time attack each. But like with my Warrior and Dark Knight example, I think the stuff around that still makes each job feel unique. At the end of the day though, this is MMO combat. It's extremely flashy MMO combat, but still nothing more than that. The game is split into dungeons, raids, and trials outside of the open world. These are the group activities. Dungeons are in general very casual and easygoing content. They require a bit more work than open world stuff, but that's obviously because you're working with 3 other people. Dungeons are the most basic of the group activities though, with them being mandatory for certain parts of the story, but the low pressure aspect and focus on visuals in some parts make them enjoyable affairs. The more interesting encounters in terms of mechanics come in the form of trials and raids. They're more like elaborate dances than dungeons are, with mechanics coming at a steady pace with you working with the team to resolve them. These can come in the form of spreading out to avoid overlapping income and damage, stacking up to share damage, heavy damage on the main tank, knockbacks threatening to push you to certain doom, to name a few. There isn't a huge variety of different mechanics outside of the few gimmicks in a few fights, but they're usually mixed up in ways that keep them fresh. It also helps that as the game goes on, all of this is made way more elaborate and interesting with the way mechanics are mixed together, or even just their presentation of them. None of this is terribly hard either, as they have story versions of most of these raids and trials, which are significantly less punishing than the extreme or savage versions of them. The only ones that don't have this are the original Coil raids, which never had a story mode version, with the fights being tuned similarly to what we would consider savage mode now. A criticism I can easily lay upon the encounters of Final Fantasy XIV is that they're all heavily scripted with little randomization. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as it means the fights can be more complex than they would be otherwise, but it also means that they become very predictable in the endgame as you grind out gear or special items the encounters can drop. This means that repeating the content becomes more tedious, like riding a roller coaster several times in a row. The first time around is exhilarating, but dulls in enjoyment if you experience it too often. Luckily there's more to do than just combat to help mix things up a bit. You can spend time in the Gold Saucer and play little minigames or enter group events such as a jumping challenge. You can get involved with chocobo racing and the training and breeding that comes with it. You can collect triple try cards and use them to challenge various NPCs found throughout the world. And yes, it works almost exactly like it did in Final Fantasy VIII. There's even tournaments, although I'm unsure how popular those are. Mahjong is also a thing, although I have literally no idea how to play that. On top of all the minigames are the Gatherer and Crafter classes. They level like the other jobs do, and unlike other crafting systems in other MMOs, this one has a rather involved process. You craft in a way that benefits from having a good rotation to both succeed at the craft and to make the items of higher quality. They all basically play the same, but I appreciate the fact that there's some actual gameplay and skill involved with the crafting, albeit not a massive amount. Gathering is pretty basic, but there's still a bunch of skills to make use of there too. There is a PvP element to the game too, in the form of 4v4 or massive battlefield modes. However, this part of the game is not very popular, and outside of the large scale engagements, it may be tough to find a game. I don't think it's terrible, but it's clearly not a focus of Final Fantasy XIV. The short version of all this really is that there's plenty of things to keep you occupied in 14, and is all in place to complement the main story, which is a definitive strength of the game, one that it does better than any of its peers. Final Fantasy XIV's story is a major focus of the game. It features a lot behind its completion, almost all gameplay elements are explained by the lore, every bit of side content has story associated with it, including your job trainer. This story focus not only makes it a Final Fantasy game, it also makes it clear that this is the JRPG of MMOs in a way too, making use of that Final Fantasy name to justify the use of cinematic cutscenes to tell the story, not just text boxes in the UI. The main story itself starts off rather slow really, but it also makes sense for it to be, in all honesty. A lot of the A Realm Reborn story is exploring the aftermath of the calamity, when Bahamut ravaged the lands of Eorzea at the end of the initial 14 story. You play as a new adventurer in one of the 3 major cities depending on your starting class choice. You start in the pirate city of Limsa Lominsa if you're a marauder or arcanist, Gridania if you're a lancer, conjurer or archer, and Ordar if you're a gladiator, thaumaturge or pugilist. The first 15 levels are dedicated to the local problems of the city-state you started in, usually dealing with the problems the local beast tribes cause the city. You're also introduced to the main antagonists of Final Fantasy XIV, the Ascians, a mysterious collection of hooded masked villains who plot some sort of twisted scheme, who also seemingly had a hand in the calamity 5 years prior. The story for most of ARR takes the form of a series of smaller stories that eventually converge into one major plot by the time it ends, with a sort of creature of the week approach for each of the different primals. Primals are a big part of the story and lore of Final Fantasy XIV. They provide a major threat to the well-being of the land, and importantly for the fans of the series, take the form of well-known summons from the series' history. The first primal you face is Ifrit, and as with most of these fights, it's pretty hype. There's a lot of good build-up to the moment you face him, and the design is rather cool. These are certainly the more secondary of your adversaries though. The major threat of A Realm Reborn comes in the form of, surprise surprise, the oppressive aggressors of the Garlean Empire. An evil empire in a Final Fantasy game? Crazy. The 14th Legion, led by Gaius van Baelsar, provides the later game threat with their intimidating magitech and militaristic might. Gaius is a decent antagonist too. He doesn't have a whole ton of screen time through the game, but he's certainly a more complex character than, say, the Final Fantasy XIII antagonist. He has reasons for pushing for the invasion of Eorzea, and he's not entirely wrong about them either, just that his methods are oftentimes questionable. The threat of the Garleans expands beyond the scope of A Realm Reborn though. Your interactions with characters throughout the game hinting at the extent of their rule outside the lands of Eorzea. In Thanalan, you spend time in a place called Little Alamigo, where refugees find shelter after fleeing their home due to Imperial invasion. Here, you hear of the way that they oppress the people of Alamigo, the will of the refugees being to one day take their home back from the cold iron grip of the Empire. Not only is this small sequence of the main scenario great world building, as it establishes what the world is like outside of Eorzea, and hints at the struggles the refugees find themselves being barred from refuge in Ordar, but it also plants the seeds for the future expansion of Stormblood. There's stuff like this throughout the whole game, where seemingly incidental details and subtle world building ends up becoming important to the major plot of Final Fantasy XIV. Even the hammy speeches the Ascians say end up taking on new meanings later on, as more about them is discovered. There's even little details that you could easily miss, such as the group of other adventurers which tackle the same start dungeons you do. It's really neat. 14 is one of those games where the more you invest yourself into the story and world of it, the more you get out. It's rather masterful in that way, and has everything you need within the game. You don't need to watch or read stuff outside of the game to understand why something happens in the plot, or for a character's motivation. which is a pitfall World of Warcraft falls into, with out-of-game material being as, if not more, crucial to the development of the plot. This is certainly not a flawlessly told story though, not by a long shot. As this is an MMO, nothing comes quickly. If the plot finds an excuse to halt the main action for a time and follow along a secondary objective for a bit, it will 100% of the time take it. This isn't often strictly bad, as they often have good excuses for doing so, but it still can feel like meandering busy work at times. To the game's credit, these distractions don't take up a massive amount of the main scenario, but these are certainly the points of the game where you feel the MMO quest design the most. A lot of the quests in 14 boil down to go here, talk to this NPC, and listen to this story. Every now and then you'll be tasked with collecting a few enemy drops or going to a location to kill an enemy that spawns there. These obviously mostly encourage you to take in the environments you're made to wander through, and they are wonderful. However, the questing itself is pretty mind-numbing at times. These are broken up every now and then with single-player instances which pit you in more interesting combat encounters, usually alongside NPCs. These are pretty fun. And obviously there's the quests that put you into the various dungeons and trials along the way. A frustrating storytelling device they use in dungeons, which thankfully they remedy by Heavensward, is adding in long cutscenes within them. Like at the end of Thousand Moors of Totarak and Stone Vigil, there's a cutscene before the final boss which can take several minutes. It's bad design as it slows down the dungeon for the other 3 people if they've been queued in via duty roulette and just want the dungeon done with. It can also suck if you're the person seeing it for the first time, as it's more than likely the other 3 will pull the boss as you watch the cutscene. Unless you're the tank or healer of course, then they have no choice but to wait. A Realm Reborn mostly focused on settling a new conflict within the world of Eorzea, one that comes from the aftermath of the calamity that happened 5 years prior in the game. Other than some characters and direct references to some events, it has little to do with concluding any plot threads left by 1.0. That is left to the binding call of Bahamut raid. This raid's story focuses on Alphino's sister, Alyssa, and her investigation into the shards of Dalamud that litter the landscape of Eorzea. This is basically the direct sequel and ending to the 1.0 story, as it focuses on answering questions such as what actually happened at the end of that cutscene that led into A Realm Reborn, the fate of the great Louisoix, the twins' grandfather who stopped Bahamut's rage. The investigation doesn't take long to get interesting. When you wander upon parts of Bahamut crystallized deep underground, with enslaved dragons and the advanced technology of a long-dead civilization protecting them. The cutscenes in this raid series are long and very good, and the encounters themselves are definitely worth experiencing in some fashion. Just don't queue for them in the duty finder. Firstly, you may not even find a group as no one queues for these anymore, and if the queue did pop somehow, someone will definitely end up leaving. Secondly, these are extremely easy to be carried through by 1 or 2 other level 80 characters by undersizing the duty. So if you have a friend or 2 on hand to help you through to see the cutscenes and enjoy the sights, then you're all set. No friends play the game? Try your luck with the party finder. Or better yet, see if people in the friendly guild, known as free companies in this game, want to tag along. It'll be worth it regardless. I wish I could go back and experience the course for the first time again. What's a story without good characters? Especially a Final Fantasy one. Well, I guess that would be one of the early NES games, but this isn't one of those. The main characters include you, as the Warrior of Light who surprisingly does get some characterization, and the Scions of the Seventh Dawn. These are Y'shtola, the no-nonsense scholar, Thancred, the lovable rogue, Ida, the mandatory perky girl character with Papalymo there to keep her in check at all times, Minfilia, a leader with a god's gift, Alphino, the naive idealistic kid who dreams big, and Oriangia, who studies old tomes so much he speaks almost exclusively in an Old English style. These characters go through a lot of character development over the course of 14 and its expansions. Alphino especially. I have a fondness for these characters for sure. Final Fantasy XIV doesn't really skimp out on the secondary characters either, although they're not as compelling as the main cast. The Grand Company leaders, for example, have good backstories, but otherwise I could take or leave them, apart from Rauban, who's legit awesome. I'm not a fan of his A Realm Reborn voice actor though, as he sounds like he's putting on a voice, and it's rather unnatural to the ear. His voice actor for Heavensward onwards has a much more natural sounding Northern English accent, which is considerably better in my opinion. Which is a point I should bring up, I suppose. When Final Fantasy XIV moved over to Heavensward, the voice-over contracts changed, and with it near enough every character got a new voice actor. For the most part, this works better. Rauban and Alphino's new actors deliver much better performances in my opinion, but I do miss the old voice actor for Admiral Merwib. But yeah, on the whole, the characters of Final Fantasy XIV are great, the villains too. Gaius is kind of a standard Final Fantasy villain, but there's more to him than it initially seems. And the dragon characters found in Heavensward provide both interesting allies and villains. They have an eldritch quality to them, which I found to be a fascinating and novel idea for dragon characters. Nidhogg being vengeance personified, and the way this is reflected in the Ishgardian side through Estinian is an engaging dynamic. This aspect of the story only seems to get better as the expansions go on. Overall, I think the story for Final Fantasy XIV is great. It doesn't always ride on that high level, which is reserved more for the expansions than A Realm Reborn. Not to say that A Realm Reborn is bad, just that it's a far slower burn than what follows it. ARR is more akin to a classic Final Fantasy tale, one that isn't really pushing any boundaries or overly spectacular in any way, but is enjoyable to go through. Once you beat that first level 50 quest and finish the base story, seeing credits for the first time, you start getting into what I would consider the actual meat of the story of this game. This is when it starts building upon your current understanding of the world, and builds events up in an honestly fantastic way to an explosive conclusion before moving on to Heavensward. The momentum that moment leaves you on carries straight forward into the rest of the story, and barely lets up. Further along past Heavensward, Stormblood I found to be extremely enjoyable despite me not thinking it's quite as engaging as Heavensward. However, I think that Stormblood has some excellent villains found within. And Shadowbringers? It's legitimately one of the best stories in this franchise, truth be told. My only caveat with Shadowbringers is obviously that you need to have invested in the whole story so far to get it, which would mean playing through the story of what amounts to about 3 RPGs worth of game beforehand. But the journey's worth it. There's scenes that can awe you, ones that can make you laugh, and especially ones that can leave you emotional. The fact I can say that about an MMO especially should talk volumes. I'm going to quickly talk spoilers, so if that's something you'd rather avoid, skip to the timestamp on the screen. With that said, let's get into it. The end of A Realm Reborn is a masterclass in tension building. It's also great for character development too. All through the 2.x series of content while dealing with the primal threats, there's a sense of unease that builds under the surface. The Alamegan refugees in Ul'dah are getting restless. Alphinaud's Crystal Braves seem to have their own internal scheming, and the Garlean Empire is resurfacing as a threat to Eorzea. All this culminates in an explosive scene which unravels all the plans the villains had built up over the course of the story so far. The Scions are framed for murdering the most important person in Ul'dah, and the Crystal Braves have been compromised, with traitors to their stated cause all the way to the top. Raoban rages and murders one of the conspirators in cold blood, chopping him in half in an imaginatively framed sequence to sell the action using their limited tools at the time. He gets his arm chopped off by a high-ranking officer of the Braves, Ilbert, and he does so in the hopes of saving Alamigo. It's all he's ever fought for. Of course, this hurts Alphinaud a lot, and takes a lot of the responsibility of what happened upon himself. He does so as he set up the Braves, and was taken advantage of what with his naive and arrogant attitude. This leads directly into his development over Heavensward and beyond. Really, really great stuff, and the reason why I think telling people to just bear with the 2.x series of content is wrong. As for bits of A Realm Reborn that I definitely don't remember fondly, it would be the lead up to the Fighting Titan, and dealing with the company of heroes nonsense. Even after the content streamlining, it still doesn't shake the fact this feels like a filler arc. Also not helping is Y'shtola lampshading the whole ordeal by pointing out how meaningless it is. Oh well, at least the dungeon and trial that come from it are pretty cool. Haurchefant is still a pretty sore subject to some members of the community. He's not the first person who plays a rather large, friendly part in the main scenario to actually die, but he is the most personal. His response to the Warrior of Light is always one of cheer and welcoming, who talks nothing but great things about your actions. It's also his family that takes you into Ishgard when you're at your lowest point. It's only fitting then that he dies while trying to protect you, his final words being something worth remembering and carrying forward.
You are unharmed? Forgive me. I could not bear the thought of... Oh, do not look at me so. A smile better suits a hero.
The final steps of Faith is the culmination of the Dragonsong War, with a showdown against Nidhogg, who has also taken over the mind of Estinian. This is such an epic conclusion to the plot of Heavensward, before it starts moving on to Stormblood, and the music during this fight. Easily one of my favourite encounters in the whole game. The Warriors of Darkness are adventurers from another world, and they take up a whole patch of content to deal with. They show another side to the powers the Warrior of Light holds though, in that the path they're on may not be as perfect for the world as it may seem. They've been misled by the Ascians, of course, but the world they herald from has suffered from an overabundance of light, causing a near world-ending catastrophe. And what did they do to cause it? Doing what you're doing throughout the entire game. Helping out and defeating demons, adventurous stuff. They were doing the right thing, and still the world fell into peril. It's an interesting dynamic and plants the seeds for the Shadowbringers expansion. What also helps is how well voiced Albert is. You can really hear the sadness and anger in his voice. Really phenomenal work by his actor Joe Dempsey.
We were just adventurers trying to make our way. An odd job here, a favour there. We never aspired to be warriors of light. But word of our deeds spread. And soon people were calling us heroes. They placed their hopes and dreams on our shoulders and bid us fight for all that was good and right. We fought, and we fought, and we fought, until there was no one left to fight. We won! And now our world is being erased from existence. We did everything right! Everything that was asked of us, and still it came to this! You of all people should understand. We will not falter! We brought our world to the brink of destruction, and now we must save it.
And that's all for spoilers. I encourage people to play the game and experience the story for themselves. It's totally worth it. A note I should add here is that all of what I've talked about is available to you in the free trial. All the story and content up to the end of the Heavensward expansion is free to play. There's restrictions in place for trial accounts, of course, like a guild cap and chat and party limitations to combat scammers and real money traders, but otherwise I struggle to get my head around how generous that trial is. The music of Final Fantasy XIV is truly wonderful. Almost exclusively composed by Masayoshi Soken, this game holds the record for the most original music made for a single video game. What's impressive is that a lot of it is so good. Obviously not all of them are total hits, a lot of tracks are meant for more ambience or unobtrusive background music for a story scene. He has a clear love for rock music, which he unleashes with the soundtrack of Shadowbringers, but overall I feel he follows in Uematsu's steps extremely well. It's wonderful work in my opinion. Some highlights for me include Torn from the Heavens, Nemesis, Serenity, Spiral. Solid. Against the Wind. And Heroes. So, to conclude then, I think Final Fantasy XIV is not only my favourite MMO, but a worthy entry into the series it's named after in terms of the strength of its story and the music it has. Obviously the multiplayer aspect isn't for everyone, and may make the game completely inaccessible for some people. You can get through the game while interacting very little with other people though, mind you. If you're just following the story along, there's gaps of hours in between forced multiplayer content, and none of it is too hard that you should feel overly pressured. Just be open to feedback if people feel you need it, and ignore or block anyone who's overly rude to you. Honestly though, I find that people in this game are rather pleasant for the most part, at least on the EU servers. So where should I place this game on my list? Well, firstly this is definitely far above 11 for me if I'm comparing apples to apples with the MMOs. They both have great settings and stories, but the no-nonsense approach that 14 takes is far more appealing to my tastes than 11's quest and level design is. So I have the awkward task of comparing this to the single player stories. I personally find 14 really fun to play. I didn't mind this retread through old ground at all. But if I were going to point out one major flaw that affects both the story and the combat in the early levels, it's the pacing. The story has a tendency to wander down a different path briefly, and the skill acquisition can feel really slow depending on your class. Dragoons get very few buttons until into the levels 50 and beyond, for example. So my major praise for the game is the story, which to me puts it above 5 and 8, but the poor pacing places it below 7 for me, which in my opinion has one of the best paced stories in RPGs. The list is on the screen now, and I think placing it 6th, just below Final Fantasy VII, and not quite breaking into the top 5, is the perfect place for it on this list. And with that, that's another Final Fantasy ranked. I hope you join me next time when I take a look at the last mainline game I'll be doing for this series. For now, Final Fantasy XV awaits. Thanks for watching.